Hey friends, Deanna here with Homestead and Chill, and I'm here today to give you a quick demonstration on how to reactivate a dry or dehydrated sourdough starter. If you snagged an organic sourdough starter from us at Homestead and Chill, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support of our small business. If not, no worries. The same instructions and process apply to any type of dehydrated sourdough starter. And I should mention too, before we get going, if you prefer to have written instructions, and we even have printable instructions, those are all on our website, and I'll add the link here if you're watching this on YouTube. But I did want to do this visual demonstration for everyone as well, for visual learners, and also to give you a better idea. It's easier to see the consistency. The consistency is the one thing that can kind of trip people up, and that's hard to tell from photos. So I'm going to show you through the whole process that takes about 5 days. So keep that in mind when you get started. It might be best to start it on a weekend or a time when you're going to be home, and also start it around the same time of day that you can do just a couple minutes of maintenance about every 24 hours. So if that's before work for you in the morning, or after work in the evening, you want to give a few minutes a day for the next 5 days to give this just a little bit of new flour and water. So that's pretty much all we're doing in this process. So the sourdough starter that we are starting with is dehydrated, but it's still very much alive. So we're going to start with about a half a tablespoon of it, and it still has alive, but they're basically dormant, beneficial yeast and bacteria. So we're going to be slowly waking them up over the next few days by a process called feeding in the sourdough world, which is basically just giving it fresh flour and water to feed on. And the reason we are starting out, and it takes 5 days to kind of gradually build them up, is because we are starting with kind of small amount, and so we want to, the bacteria and yeast that are in there can't handle fermenting or feeding off of a really large volume of flour and water right away. So we need to kind of gradually increase the volume of flour and water over 5 days. And then by the end, you'll be left with a huge, big, bubbly, active sourdough starter that can last you a lifetime if you maintain it, which is pretty easy to do. So the supplies that we're going to need for this whole project, really simple. The first couple of days, we're going to start in just a basic, pint-sized mason jar, something like that. Even if you don't have a mason jar, a glass, like a drinking glass with a lid, or a plate even sitting on top is fine. Doesn't need to be airtight, but you do want to cover it during the process so that, dirt and dust and cat hair or whatever else doesn't fall inside your sourdough starter. So again, doesn't have to be airtight, but you want to be able to cover it up. Some folks even slip it in like a plastic bag or something like that. And then after, I think it's on day 3 or 4, I'll have to recheck my instructions here, but we'll gradually go up to a slightly larger container. So as we're adding our flour and water, the sourdough starter will grow in size, and so you can advance to a larger container after a few days. And I'll walk you through that whole process, and I'm going to show you each day as we go. So this is a 1-liter container. This is actually what we normally store our personal sourdough starter in. And then for other bigger projects, or if you're a really avid baker, if you're going to bake really frequently or multiple loaves at a time, some bakers do store it in a larger, like a 2-liter container. So that is what you need as far as containers go. And then again, we're starting out with a half a tablespoon of dry sourdough starter, and then you will need flour as well. We prefer to use an organic bread flour. You can use just a regular all-purpose flour as well. Either way, I suggest starting with a white flour, and you can always change it in the future to a wheat-based flour. And we oftentimes do feed our ongoing starter on an ongoing basis half wheat and half rye, but it is good just to kind of get it started with something more simple like a white flour. And then water, if possible, is best to be filtered or unchlorinated, because you already are starting with a pretty robust amount of beneficial bacteria and yeast. A little bit of tap water probably isn't going to kill it, but if you can use filtered water, then that is best. So that is basically the process or what you need to get started, and then I will show you day by day over the next 5 days how we're going to turn just this tiny bit amount of dry powder into something like this. So it is starting day, or day 1. So we have a clean container here. This is just a pint mason jar, and then our half a tablespoon of sourdough starter. So if you're starting with the Homestead and Chill sourdough starter, this is already pre-measured for you at half a tablespoon. If you're using another one, just grab a half tablespoon measurement and put it in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and dump that in there. Okay. Now, next is a tablespoon and 1/2 of filtered or dechlorinated room temperature water if possible. Cold water throughout this whole process will actually slow the bacterial growth, the beneficial bacterial growth. So try to keep a room temperature water available for this process. So we're gonna go 1. And 1/2. And then next we want to mix this just a little bit, and we're gonna let it sit for a couple minutes. We're gonna let this sit a couple minutes before we add any flour. So I'm just gonna stir this. And I'm gonna go dry off my tablespoon because that's how much flour we need, and I'll be right back to add that. Okay, so that's nice and mixed and milky there. Some dehydrated sourdough starters are a bit more flaky and chunky than ours, so that's why you want to give it a couple minutes to kind of combine with that water. So now I'm going to get my pretty level tablespoon of flour here, add that in, and give that a little mix as well. Good. And throughout this process too, you do, sorry for the banging, you do want to try to keep the sides of your container pretty clean. So as you go, kind of scrape the sides and stuff, because the more junk that gets up on the sides, it's going to cake and crust and actually could potentially risk molding, but it shouldn't. So we got that in there. Now all I'm going to do is put a lid on it. Again, doesn't need to be airtight, but you want to keep stuff from falling in there and getting contaminated, you know, especially if you have a lot of mold spores or something like that in your area. So we're just going to keep this covered, and I'm going to set this in our kitchen on the countertop. Ideal fermentation temperature is around 75 degrees. And so if you're doing this in the winter time, try to find a little bit warmer area if your house is really cool. So we're gonna come back in 24 hours and check and see how we're doing. So it is day 2 and it's been about 24 hours. It's kind of hard to see, but if you can look closely, you see just a few little bubbles starting to develop. But otherwise, it hasn't changed a whole lot, and that's totally normal for this stage. So you might see a little bubble activity or really nothing at all. So today, we're adding 1 tablespoon of flour and 2 teaspoons of water. 1 and 2. And just like yesterday, I'm just going to get this mixed up. Covered up, and another 24 hours. Okay, friends, now it is day 3. So 48 hours after first starting this guy. And you can see we've got a lot more bubbles than yesterday. So that is looking perfect. And today is exactly like yesterday. So we're going to do the same 1 tablespoon of flour. All right, it is day 4 and we're gonna do a larger feeding today, but I'm showing you this close up really quick first because I wanna point out a couple things. It's kind of hard to tell because I dirtied up the top of the glass just a little bit, but if you can see these smears that are kind of coming down here, that is where this starter actually rose during the last 24 hours and now it's fallen back down. So that's a sign that it got active, it was getting bubbly, and then it fell back down saying that, hey, I'm hungry now. So this is day 4 and I just showed you how it had risen just a little bit and fallen back down, and now today is a little different than the last 2 days where we're gonna go ahead and increase the amount of flour and water we're feeding it. So today, now we're doing a 1/3 cup flour, and this is going to be the last day that we're going to keep it in this size container. We're going to increase to a larger container tomorrow. So that was a 1/3 cup flour, and now we're doing a 1/4 cup of filtered kind of room temperature water. And just get this mixed in again. And so what I'm also going to do today now is I have this little wine glass marker, like a pen that's made for writing on glass, but you can also put a rubber band around this guy and mark the level. I can't do it without twisting it here, but I'm going to mark the level of where the flour is or where the level of the starter is, so that we can watch it rise. So I have it marked over there, so we can watch it rise. So now over the next 12 to 24 hours, it might actually get active even quicker. So the 24-hour rule no longer completely applies. The next time to feed it will be once it rises to at least double in size and then starts to fall back down. When it starts to fall back down or falls all the way back down to that starting line that we make, that's when it's hungry and ready for the next step. So it should be probably tomorrow, but it might be, if you're doing this in the morning, even later this afternoon or evening. It is the next morning, so that last step that I showed you was done in the late afternoon. And as I kind of suspected would happen, it rose and then fell overnight. So I didn't quite get to show you what it looked like when it was at peak activity. But if you look closely, again, here was our starting line, you can see the smears around the side that show it rose about double up to this area. So it's ready for the next step, and that is moving up to a larger container. So we're going to jump up to a 1 liter container in this step, and I'll show you that with significantly more flour and water than we've done before. As you can see, I grabbed a little mixing bowl here because you could, dump this starter into the larger container, but it makes kind of a mess trying to mix it all in place. But you can definitely do that when we feed on an ongoing basis. We do just do it right in its own container. But just for demonstration and to keep things a little bit more neat today, I'm going to go ahead and do this in a separate bowl. So first, we're going to take our starter and get that out into the bowl here. This is a scant cup of flour, so not quite a full cup, almost a full cup of flour, and a half cup now of our room temperature filtered water. And so there's 2 different kinds of methods moving forward for feeding a sourdough starter. And this is the same ratio that we use now on an ongoing basis feeding our mature starter, which is that scant cup to half a cup of water. And what this is these are actually about equal weights in volume, in grams, I mean. So about 100 grams of flour is about a scant cup, and about 100 grams of water, if you were to weigh it on a scale, is about half a cup. I'm gonna go ahead and get that scant cup in there, and our half cup. And this is also a great time to mention too that the amounts don't need to be exact precise. With time, you're going to learn how to read and judge your starter based on the consistency. And so that's one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of this video, was some folks have an issue with consistency. And more often than not, if your starter doesn't seem to be getting as active as you'd like, it might be too runny. So you can see here that this is pretty thick. I'm going to get it mixed a little bit better here. But if it's real runny, like pourable thin pancake batter, then it's not going to rise quite as nicely. This is even a little thin. It's not too bad. This will thicken up as it rises at room temperature. But as you can kind of see on the consistency, it sort of leaves a little trail as you pull back. It doesn't just immediately run like pure liquid back into itself. So this is a good texture. You could even do a little thicker than this. If it's much thinner than this, what happens is the bubbles that rise up will actually just rise straight through the starter and not be trapped inside, rather than when it's a little thicker, the bubbles are trapped inside and it causes the entire thing to rise and increase in volume. So if it looks any thinner than this, feel free to add a little bit more flour. You can definitely experiment and stray from these exact amounts that I'm recommending today. So just again, based on your flour type, the humidity in your home, even your measuring cups and different things like that can cause some slight variances. So just feel comfortable with, making tweaks and edits as you see fit. Okay, there she is in her new forever home. So we're going to go ahead and mark the side again. I didn't grab my pen, so I'll do that. But mark the side again, and we're going to watch her start to rise over the next few hours. There's our starting point, and it's about 9 in the morning. So we'll see how long it takes for this baby to get nice and bubbly and active for us. So check that out. It has been just under 3 hours, and it has already doubled in size, and is plenty bubbly and active. I'm going to let it sit a little longer and see if we can get even more activity and rise out of it before I open it up and stir it and kind of show you the consistency there. But now is a perfect time to talk about peak activity. So when a sourdough starter is at this state where it's at least doubled in size and it's kind of staying at a nice elevated height but hasn't started to fall back down yet, that is peak activity. That's when the yeast and the bacteria are nice and happy. Once they start to fall back down, that means that they're hungry and they're less active. That peak activity level, where it has more than doubled in size or about doubled in size and isn't falling back down, is the perfect time to use it for baking. So because this starter is still pretty young, you could definitely go ahead and bake with it on this day 5 of development if you'd like to. However, you might want to feed it one more time to just really get it nice and active before, trying to bake a sourdough loaf or something like that. You might not get quite as much oomph and rise in your loaf using a kind of young, immature starter like this. The more you feed it and the more it gets used to your home, actually new different bacteria and yeast strains can get introduced with time, so it'll kind of change over time in your own home, then the stronger it's going to be. Okay, let's see how she looks. Beautiful bubbles. And so that's the perfect consistency where it looks about like marshmallow fluff once it's all ready and active. Ta-da! That wasn't so hard, was it? So hopefully you saw through that demonstration that the process of turning a dehydrated sourdough starter into an active, bubbly, ready to bake with sourdough starter is nothing to be afraid of, and it's really pretty foolproof. So now that you have your sourdough starter, all your baking dreams can come true. You can make rustic, crusty loaves of sourdough bread, focaccia, cornbread, pizza crust, crackers, you name it. All you need to do is keep your sourdough starter alive. And that isn't that difficult or intimidating either, trust me. All it really needs is routine feeding. And so the frequency at which you feed your sourdough starter just depends on how you store it. Some bakers store their starter at room temperature, and if you do that, that's great if you're going to bake really frequently, but then it needs to be fed every day or maybe even twice a day. For us, that's a little bit much, and we don't bake quite that much. So we just store ours in the fridge, and then we take it out and bake with it and feed it during that process once every week or even every other week. So if you can swing that and just give it a weekly feeding, or even every other week, store it in the fridge, you're going to be good to go for quite some time. So for more information about ongoing feeding and storing and maintenance of your sourdough starter, and for all kinds of recipes that we bake with, go ahead and check out the sourdough section of Homestead and Chill, and you'll find tons of articles there, and I will include a link to that section of our blog here in the caption as well. And I hope that you enjoy baking, and thank you for tuning in today.